Sign over the property now, or you're no longer my daughter.
Then I choose freedom.
You just made the biggest mistake of your life.
He certainly did. I brought the evidence.
My father slapped me across the face in front of 137 wedding guests. The room went silent. My husband stepped between us and said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Then an elderly woman in a silver dress rose from the last table and began walking toward my father. "Hello, my name is Claire Bennett. I was 34 years old when my wedding became the day my family's oldest secret finally came into the light. Until that moment, I had spent most of my life believing my father was difficult because he loved me. He controlled where I studied, criticized every man I dated, and demanded a detailed explanation whenever I spent my own money. He called it protection. My mother called it his strong personality. I called it normal because I did not know anything else. My father, Richard Bennett, owned a construction company outside Charleston, South Carolina. To the public, he was charming and generous. His company sponsored youth baseball teams, donated building materials after hurricanes, and placed a full-page Christmas message in the local newspaper every year. At home, kindness always came with a price. When I was 16, he bought me a used car and kept the only spare key. If I came home 10 minutes late, he took the car for a week. When I was 22, he paid the security deposit on my first apartment, then entered it without warning because, as he said, his money gave him that right. By the time I met Daniel Foster, I had learned to smile whenever my father gave me an order. Daniel noticed the smile was not real. We met at a neighborhood legal clinic where I volunteered on Saturdays. I worked as an interior designer, but I helped elderly homeowners organize repair estimates and insurance documents. The Daniel was a commercial attorney who volunteered there twice a month. He was calm, thoughtful, and never tried to rescue me from problems I could solve myself. That was what made me trust him. 6 months after we began dating, my grandmother Evelyn died. Grandma Evelyn was my mother's mother, but she had never trusted my father. She was polite to him at holidays and cold to him when no one else was watching. When I was a child, she sometimes held my face between her hands and said, "One day, Claire, make sure you own something no one can take from you." I thought she meant confidence. She meant property. In her will, she left me Rosewood House, a weathered but beautiful property on 12 acres near the Ashley River. The house had peeling paint, a damaged roof, and a garden that had almost disappeared beneath the weeds. It was also worth nearly $2 million, because the land sat beside an expanding luxury development. My father's interest was immediate. At the will reading, he placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "You don't need the headache. Transfer it to the company, and I'll manage it for you." I said I wanted time to think. His hand tightened. "There is nothing to think about," he whispered. That evening, Daniel asked me what I wanted. Not what my father wanted. Not what the property was worth, but what I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted to restore Rosewood House and turn part of it into a retreat for women rebuilding their lives after financial or emotional abuse. Grandma Evelyn had quietly supported a local shelter for years. Using her house that way felt right. Daniel smiled and said, "Then that is what we protect." For the next year, I repaired the roof, stabilized the foundation, and created a business plan. I used my savings and a small loan secured only by my income. I did not ask my father for $1. Still, he acted as if the house belonged to him. He sent surveyors onto the land without my permission. He invited investors to walk around the property. Once, I found a proposed site plan inside his office showing 28 luxury townhouses where Grandma's garden stood. When I confronted him, he laughed. "Those are only ideas, don't become dramatic." Then his company began struggling. At first, I heard rumors about delayed projects. Next came unpaid subcontractors. My mother insisted everything was fine, but my father started calling me late at night to discuss Rosewood House. "Family assets should support the family," he said. "It is not a family asset," I replied. "Grandma left it to me." His voice turned cold. "Your grandmother filled your head with poison." 2 months before my wedding, he invited Daniel and me to dinner. A folder waited beside my plate. Inside was a deed transferring Rosewood House to Bennett Development Holdings for $1. My father spoke as if the decision had already been made. "Sign it now, and we can enjoy dinner." I pushed the folder away. He stared at me. My mother stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel said, "Richard, Claire has answered you." My father's expression changed. It was the first time Daniel had openly challenged him. "This is a family matter," my father said. "Claire is my family," Daniel replied. We left without eating. The next morning, my wedding venue called. Someone claiming to be my father had tried to cancel the reception and recover the deposit. 2 days later, my florist received new instructions to reduce the order. Then my bank flagged an attempt to access the account I used for Rosewood House. I wanted to believe these were misunderstandings. Daniel did not. He helped me change every password, add a verbal security code to the wedding contracts, and place the property inside a trust. I remained the beneficiary and decision maker, but the trust created another legal wall between my father and the land. We did not tell him. That was when the mystery deepened. While reviewing old property records, Daniel found a document from 29 years earlier. Grandma Evelyn had not bought Rosewood House alone. A second investor had provided almost half the purchase money, but her name had later disappeared from the final deed. Her name was Margaret Hale. I had never heard of her. We searched newspaper archives and court databases. Margaret had been my grandmother's closest friend and business partner. Together, they had planned to open a small residential center for women leaving dangerous homes. Before it opened, a fire damaged one wing of Rosewood House. The insurance company refused most of the claim, and the plan collapsed. 6 months later, Margaret moved to Virginia. One detail bothered Daniel. The attorney who prepared the final deed was my father's uncle. I began looking through Grandma Evelyn's boxes. Most contained photographs, recipes, and old bills. At the bottom of a cedar chest, I found a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. The final letter was addressed to me. My hands shook as I opened it. The grandma wrote that my father had pressured her for years to sell Rosewood House. She believed he had once forged her signature on a loan application, although the bank had discovered the problem before releasing the money. She also wrote that Margaret Hale still owned a private financial interest in the original charitable project. Then came the line that changed everything. If Richard ever becomes desperate for Rosewood, do not face him alone. Find Margaret. She knows what he did after the fire. I read the sentence 3 times. What had my father done after the fire? Daniel found Margaret living in Richmond. She was 78 and had spent most of her career managing nonprofit housing programs. I sent her a careful letter with a copy of Grandma's note. She called me the next day. Her voice was steady, but when she said my name, she began to cry. Margaret told me the Rosewood fire had not been an accident. She could not prove who started it, but she had seen my father's truck leaving the back road that night. He was only 25 at the time and already working for his uncle's construction business. After the fire, Richard offered to buy the damaged property for almost nothing. Grandma refused. Margaret, frightened and newly widowed, moved away. She signed an agreement allowing Grandma to hold her interest while the property recovered. Your grandmother protected my share, Margaret said, and I protected the evidence she was too afraid to keep. The evidence included copies of letters my father had sent his uncle. In one, he complained that the fire had failed to force a sale. In another, he described Rosewood as land that would be worth millions once the highway expanded. The letters did not prove arson beyond doubt, but they proved a long pattern of pressure, deception, and financial motive. Margaret also had something more recent. 3 months before Grandma died, my father had contacted her. He offered her $50,000 to surrender any claim connected to Rosewood House and sign a strict confidentiality agreement. Margaret refused. She saved every email. I felt sick. This was not a sudden attempt to save a failing company. My father had been chasing that land for nearly 3 decades. Daniel wanted me to report everything immediately. I asked him to wait until we understood the current danger. I did not want revenge based on suspicion. I wanted facts strong enough to survive my father's lies. So we investigated quietly. An accountant reviewed public filings and liens connected to Bennett Development. My father owed millions. A major lender was prepared to freeze the company's credit unless he produced new collateral before the end of the month. Our wedding was 6 days before that deadline. Rosewood House was his last possible rescue. Suddenly, every strange wedding decision made sense. My father had insisted on paying for the reception venue, although Daniel and I could afford it. He had invited bankers, business partners, and local officials I barely knew. He kept saying the wedding would show everyone that the Bennett family remained strong. It was not only my wedding to him, it was a business performance, and he planned to obtain my signature while the entire room celebrated him. Daniel asked if I wanted to cancel. I thought about it all night. Then I said no. I had spent my life changing plans whenever my father became angry. I would not let him take my wedding too. We gave copies of the letters and financial records to Daniel's law partner. We informed venue security that my father was not authorized to change any arrangement. We also invited Margaret Hale. She agreed to come but asked to sit at the last table. She did not want my father to see her until it was necessary. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel waited beneath an old oak tree while I walked toward him. For those few minutes, the fear disappeared. When he promised to stand beside me in truth and hardship and enjoy, his voice did not shake, mine did. At the reception, my father acted like the perfect host. He shook hands, told stories, and repeatedly mentioned that Rosewood House would soon become a Bennett family legacy project. Each time he said it, Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. After dinner, my father took the microphone. He welcomed Daniel to the family. He praised my mother. He described himself as a father who had sacrificed everything for his only daughter. Then he said he had one final wedding gift. His assistant carried a white leather folder to the center of the dance floor. My stomach tightened. My father opened the folder and displayed a document with gold ribbons attached to it. Claire and Daniel have agreed to place Rosewood House into the Bennett family company. In return, I am giving them a permanent share in our future development. The guests applauded. I did not move. My father held out a pen. Come on, sweetheart, he said. Make it official. More than 100 people turned toward me. Cameras rose. My mother stood near the cake with tears in her eyes, silently begging me to cooperate. For one dangerous second, I became a child again. I wanted to sign simply to end the pressure. Then I remembered Grandma's words, own something no one can take from you. I walked onto the dance floor, took the microphone, and said, I never agreed to this transfer. Rosewood House is not for sale. The applause died. My father kept smiling, but his eyes changed. He leaned closer. Do not embarrass me. I answered clearly enough for everyone to hear. You brought private legal documents to my wedding. You embarrassed yourself. A few guests gasped. He pushed the pen into my hand. Sign it. I placed the pen on the table. No. His mask disappeared. He grabbed my arm and whispered that his company would collapse because of me. He said hundreds of workers would lose their jobs. He said my mother would lose her home. He said Grandma had made me selfish and Daniel had turned me against my own blood. I pulled my arm free. Your debts are not my responsibility, I said. That was when he struck me. The sound was sharp and flat. My head turned. A champagne glass fell somewhere behind me and shattered on the floor. For a moment, I felt nothing. Then heat spread across my cheek. Daniel stepped between us. He did not raise his voice. That made his words even more powerful. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. My father looked around and seemed to realize that every phone in the room was recording him. He tried to recover. This is a family misunderstanding, he announced. My daughter is emotional. Then a chair moved at the last table. Margaret Hale rose in her silver dress and began walking across the room. My father saw her. All the color left his face. Hello, Richard, she said. He stepped backward. Margaret stopped beside me and took my hand. She faced the guests and introduced herself as Grandma Evelyn's former business partner. Then she turned to my father. You have spent 29 years trying to steal this property, she said. Tonight, you finally did it in front of witnesses. My father called her a liar. Daniel's law partner approached with 2 uniformed officers who had been waiting near the venue entrance. We had not expected violence, but because of the forged documents and my father's escalating threats, Daniel had arranged for an off-duty officer to provide security. After the slap, the matter was no longer only financial. One officer asked whether I wanted to make a report. My father stared at me with complete confidence. He believed I would protect him. I always had. I touched my burning cheek and said, "Less." That single word ended his control over me. The officers escorted him from the reception. My mother followed them, sobbing and asking me to fix everything. I told her I could not fix what I had not broken. The room remained silent after the doors closed. I looked at our guests. My dress was still white. The music had stopped. Half the people present were strangers invited to support my father's image. I took the microphone again. I am sorry you witnessed that, I said. But I am not sorry I said no. If anyone here has ever been told that love requires surrendering your safety, your voice, or your future, please know that it does not. Margaret began clapping. Then Daniel's mother joined her. Soon the entire room was standing. Daniel asked the band to play our first dance song. My cheek was swollen, and police lights still flashed beyond the windows. But I danced with my husband anyway. The consequences arrived quickly. The document my father brought to the wedding contained a signature that looked like mine on an attached preliminary agreement. I had never signed it. A forensic document examiner later confirmed that the signature had been copied from an old design contract. Investigators found emails showing that my father intended to use the transferred property as collateral the morning after the wedding. His assistant had warned him that I had not agreed. He replied that I would not refuse him in front of a crowd. He had built his entire plan on my fear of making a scene. He was charged with assault and financial crimes, connected to the forged agreement. The old letters were turned over to investigators as well. The fire was too old and the evidence too limited for an arson charge, but Margaret's records helped establish his long-term motive and pattern of conduct. Bennett Development entered bankruptcy 3 weeks later. My father blamed me publicly. He told former employees that I had destroyed the company. But the bankruptcy records revealed years of reckless borrowing, hidden losses, and money transferred into private accounts. The company had not died because I refused to save it. It had died because he had treated every person and every asset as something he could use. My mother stayed with him for another 4 months. Then she called me from a hotel. For the first time in my life, she did not ask me to forgive him. She admitted she had known about some of the forged paperwork. She had told herself she was keeping the family together. In reality, she had been helping him keep me afraid. I did not immediately welcome her back into my life. Forgiveness without boundaries would have been another form of surrender. We began with counseling, short phone calls, and honest answers. Some relationships can be repaired, but only after everyone stops pretending the damage never happened. My father eventually accepted a plea agreement. He received a prison sentence, followed by supervised release, and was ordered to pay restitution related to several fraudulent transactions. The punishment did not return the years I spent fearing him. Still, justice gave those years a name. What he had done was not protection, it was control. 1 year after the wedding, Daniel and I reopened Rosewood House. Margaret donated her remaining financial interest to the new nonprofit and became the first chairwoman of its board. We named the residential program the Evelyn and Margaret Center. It offered temporary housing, legal support, career counseling, and financial education to women starting over. On opening day, I stood in Grandma's restored garden. The roses had returned, children ran between the oak trees. Sunlight covered the porch that my father once planned to tear down. My mother attended quietly and sat in the back row. When the ceremony ended, she approached me and touched the faint place on my cheek where the bruise had once been. "I should have protected you," she said. I answered, "You should have protected yourself too." Then we walked into the house together. Not as if everything had been forgiven, but as two women finally learning that silence was not peace. People sometimes ask whether my father ruined my wedding. He did not. He revealed himself at my wedding. There is a difference. The photograph I treasure most is not the one of Daniel and me beneath the oak tree. It is a photograph taken moments after the police cars left. My cheek is red. Margaret stands on one side of me. Daniel stands on the other. I am holding the unsigned deed in both hands, tearing it straight down the middle. That picture reminds me of the exact moment I stopped confusing obedience with love. My father wanted Rosewood House because he believed property was power. Grandma left it to me because she understood something deeper. Power is the freedom to say no and survive what happens next. And that is why the most important vow I made on my wedding day was not only the vow I made to my husband. It was the one I finally made to myself. No one would ever purchase my silence with the promise of love again.